To get started animating in After Effects, it's important just to bear in mind exactly what we're talking about when we talk about animating something, particularly in a program like After Effects. Animation means changing something's property over time. We have objects here sitting out on our composition window, and each one of these objects has a number of properties. Now, the basic properties that we'll be dealing with to begin with are visible down in the timeline of the composition. So star 2, which is my star on the right hand side there, has a transform drop down hidden inside in that layer. So the little arrows to the left hand side of the layers can be opened, and the transform then can be opened itself to show a number of different properties. What we're dealing with when we do most animations are the anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Now, the anchor point is this little center crosshairs in the middle of our object there. Now, what the anchor point does is it gives us some sort of a reference point around which the properties can change. So an anchor point that's in the center will make sure that when something is transformed, it will transform around that center point, or when something is rotated, it will rotate around that anchor point. If I move the anchor point by changing any of these values here, you'll see that the anchor point is actually moved away from that center point. The position is straightforward. It will just reposition the object on the X and or the Y axes. The scale will size the object up or down. Rotation, as you would imagine, will rotate the object, and the opacity will change whether it is transparent or opaque. Now let's have a look at these values here. So for the anchor point and the position, we're dealing with values such as the X and Y properties. So with the position, when I change the X and the Y property, then it's going to change whether the object moves to the left or the right, or up and down. Scale deals in percentages. If we're using, if it's at 100%, it's at its normal size that it was brought in at. And we can change either the horizontal or vertical properties by unlinking both of those. Rotation allows you to rotate in a number of degrees or in a number of rotations. Now you don't notice it rotating because it rotates one full cycle for each revolution, and we won't notice that until we animate it. So I'll just change that back to 0. And the opacity again is a percentage value, 100% being fully opaque or visible, 0 being completely transparent. So these are our properties, and in order for us to animate something, we're going to be changing these over time. Now this is something that you have to get used to thinking about, because first of all, we're dealing with just moving things and changing things in terms of their transparency, but anything at all that changes visually about an object in After Effects is going to be a property that's going to change over time, and that time is visible down here in our timeline. Now what I'll do is a simple position animation here, just to show you how these properties are changed over time. After Effects uses a number of different ways to animate, but keyframes are at the center of all or most of those animations. Keyframes are created on a particular property by clicking the little stopwatch to begin with. What it does, when you click this stopwatch icon, you're telling After Effects, start recording any change in properties as I move from this point. So if I click on the position, you'll see I now have a little yellow lozenge here with a couple of arrows on the right and the left hand side of it, and I have another little lozenge here. This is my keyframe. What a keyframe does is it records this property with these values at this point on the timeline. Okay, so the position has an X and a Y value, which is going to be recorded here. When I go to 2 seconds and change any of these values, so if I change the X, for instance, and move it off to the left, that value for that property is now going to be recorded in that keyframe. And what After Effects does is it takes this recorded value and this recorded value, and it makes up all of the values in between in what's called interpolation. Interpolation means assigning values in between two keyframes. So now when I hit the spacebar to play this, you'll see the animation take effect. Now, just bear in mind that what I've done here is I've recorded a property's values here, I've recorded a property's values here, and After Effects has interpolated all of the frames in between to go from that point to that point. The visible result of those changes of the properties is the star moving from right to left. So that's just a visible result of the change in properties over time.